The sun was dropping low on the horizon when the Navy SEAL team cut across the uneven ground. The day had been long, their mission grueling, and fatigue was setting in as they approached the final stretch of their trek. Dust clung to their boots, and sweat had dried into salty streaks across their faces. But their movements remained sharp, practiced, efficient. This was routine for them. Harsh terrain, long hours, silence broken only by coded commands. But the silence shattered the moment they spotted her. At first, it didn't register. From a distance, the figure looked like just another casualty of the wilderness, someone who had stumbled, maybe fallen, and been claimed by the merciless ground. One of the men raised a hand, signaling halt. They all froze, their instincts sharpened from years of operating in hostile environments. Anything out of place could be a trap. The medic, Chief Petty Officer Ryan Callahan, was the first to move forward. His eyes, trained to read bodies, saw what others might miss, the faint rise and fall of her chest. She was alive. As he approached, he expected to hear sobbing or frantic gasps for help, the natural response of someone badly injured. Instead, there was only silence. She was sitting against a jagged rock, one hand pressed firmly against her ribcage, her other arm limp at her side. Blood stained her shirt, dark and spreading, but her face was calm. She met Ryan's eyes without flinching, as if she had been expecting him. He dropped to his knees beside her. "Easy," he muttered, his voice steady but low. He reached for her wrist to check her pulse. Strong, steady, too steady. Her breathing wasn't ragged or panicked. It was controlled, measured. She inhaled deeply, held the breath for several seconds, and released it with quiet precision. Ryan frowned. Most civilians in this state would be on the edge of shock, hyperventilating, thrashing, begging for help. But not her. "Name?" Ryan asked, his hands already moving to assess the injury. He didn't expect much of an answer. He rarely did in situations like this. But the silence that followed was almost unnerving. She didn't speak. Not a sound. The other SEALs tightened their perimeter, keeping watch on the surroundings, but Ryan could feel their eyes flicking back toward her. They were trained to pick up subtle details too, and she wasn't behaving like any injured person they'd ever rescued. As he lifted her bloodied shirt carefully, his eyes narrowed. The wound wasn't fresh. It looked like she'd already worked on herself. Strips of fabric had been tied expertly around her torso, compressing the bleeding. It wasn't perfect, but it was damn good for someone working alone and under stress. Too good. Ryan leaned closer, studying her. "You do this yourself?" Her eyes flickered, but she didn't answer. He tightened his jaw. Something about this wasn't right. Civilians didn't just happen to know how to slow bleeding like this. Civilians didn't sit quietly while their blood seeped into the dirt. Civilians didn't meet his gaze with the calm of someone who had seen worse and knew how to endure. The silence grew heavier, filled only by the sound of his gloves brushing against fabric and the faint shuffle of boots around them as his team stayed alert. "Boss," one of the SEALs whispered, keeping his voice low. "She's not acting normal." Ryan didn't respond immediately. He was too busy noticing the subtle things. The way she shifted her weight to avoid putting pressure on her wound. The way her hand maintained perfect placement over the bleeding area until he replaced it with his own. Every movement she made had intention, efficiency. Nothing wasted. "You're not just some lost hiker, are you?" Ryan muttered under his breath. Her eyes met his again, sharp, calculating, unyielding. She still didn't speak. It unsettled him, and he hated admitting that. He was used to seeing people broken by pain, crying out, clinging to him like a lifeline. But this woman, she was holding her own. Injured, yes. Vulnerable, yes. But weak? Not even close. He cleaned the wound quickly, working with swift precision, But his mind kept circling back to the same thought. How? How did she know what to do before they arrived? How was she still upright, still steady, still breathing like someone in training? One of the seals crouched nearby, watching. She hasn't made a sound since we found her? Ryan didn't look up. She doesn't need to. The words slipped out before he realized he'd spoken them. But they were true. Every part of her silence felt deliberate, as if she had chosen to let her body speak instead. He tightened the bandage around her torso, and still she didn't flinch. The silence wasn't just strange now, it was intimidating. She wasn't afraid of them, or of the pain. She was controlling it, mastering it. For a brief moment, Ryan wondered if she was testing them. He shook the thought away and focused on the work. Yet the question nagged at him. Who the hell was she? By the time he finished stabilizing her, the rest of the team was visibly restless. They weren't used to mysteries. Their missions thrived on clarity, friend or foe, threat or harmless. But this woman blurred the line. "Chief," one of them murmured, "what do you make of her?" Ryan finally sat back on his heels and looked at her fully. She sat upright, bloodied and pale, but the quiet poise of someone who refused to be broken. Her eyes were unblinking, her breathing calm, her silence louder than words. "I don't know yet," Ryan admitted. "But she's not what she looks like." The team exchanged glances. In their world, unpredictability was dangerous. And this woman was nothing but unpredictable. As the sun dipped lower, shadows stretched across the ground, and the air cooled with the coming night. They would have to move soon, but no one said it out loud. Their eyes kept drifting back to her, silently demanding answers. Ryan felt it too. For the first time in years, he wasn't just treating a wound, he was staring at a riddle. And something in his gut told him that this woman, silent and bloodied as she was, would leave a mark on them, far deeper than her injury suggested. She was injured, yes, but quiet. Too quiet. And that silence left them all speechless. The SEAL team moved cautiously through the rugged terrain, the woman now partially stabilized under Chief Petty Officer Ryan Callahan's watchful care. The sun had slipped below the horizon, leaving streaks of orange fading into purple, while shadows stretched long and heavy. The air cooled quickly, but tension kept everyone sharp. Ryan couldn't shake the thought gnawing at him since they'd found her. She wasn't ordinary. He'd seen thousands of injuries, some civilians, some combat veterans, but none had behaved like her. Pain usually stripped people down to their most primal selves, panic, fear, desperation. Yet she carried herself like someone who had already made peace with pain. He knelt beside her again, shining his small tactical light over the bandage he'd secured. Blood had slowed, but her ribs rose and fell in a way that caught his attention. It wasn't shallow or erratic. It was deliberate counted breaths, held for exact intervals before release. The kind of breathing used to slow heart rate, conserve oxygen, and sharpen focus. Ryan knew the drill because he used it himself. "Box breathing," he murmured without meaning to. One of the SEALs glanced over. "What?" "Nothing," Ryan muttered quickly. But inside, his mind was racing. Box breathing was taught in special training to manage combat stress, to keep the body functional when adrenaline and fear threatened to spiral out of control. It wasn't something an untrained hiker would just figure out. He studied her face in the dim light. Despite the pallor of blood loss, her expression held no panic. She blinked slowly, as though measuring every movement, conserving strength. "Boss," whispered Torres, the youngest in the squad, crouching a few feet away. "She doesn't look scared." Shouldn't she? I don't know. Be freaking out? Ryan didn't answer. His gut told him Torres was right, but there was more to it. This wasn't just about not being afraid, this was control. When the woman shifted slightly, trying to ease her weight against the rock, Ryan saw something else. Her hand moved with precision, sliding from her ribs to brace against the ground in a way that avoided putting strain on her side. Every adjustment she made looked intentional, not like trial and error, like instinct born from practice. "Careful," Ryan said softly, steadying her shoulder. Her eyes flicked toward him, sharp and aware. Again, she said nothing. But in that look, Ryan felt something unsettling. She understood exactly what he was doing, not as a passive patient, but as someone who knew the procedure herself. He sat back for a second, his mind spinning. He remembered the tourniquet he'd found, tied around her torso when they first arrived. The knot had been tight, well-placed, something that took training. He thought back to how she'd pressed directly against the wound with her palm, holding steady even while blood soaked her shirt. She hadn't panicked, hadn't wasted motion. She'd been buying herself time, the way a soldier would. Ryan felt his throat tighten as the realization sank in deeper. "She knows what she's doing," he muttered under his breath. "Knows what?" asked Mason, the team's point man, from the edge of the perimeter. Ryan didn't answer right away. His eyes stayed on her as she adjusted her posture again. He noticed how she shifted her breathing when he touched near the injury, bracing in anticipation, then relaxing when the pressure eased. She wasn't reacting randomly. She was working with him, as if she'd been in his shoes before. "She knows how to stay alive," Ryan finally said. The words hung heavy in the cool night air. The other SEALs went quiet, each man glancing toward her with renewed suspicion and respect. For a while, no one spoke. They just watched as Ryan rechecked her vitals. Stronger than expected, considering the blood loss. She was holding herself together, better than many seasoned soldiers he had treated. Ryan leaned in closer, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "You're trained, aren't you?" Her eyes locked on his, but she didn't answer. He wasn't sure what frustrated him more, the silence, or the fact that her silence spoke louder than words ever could. He could see it in her gaze. She wasn't confused, she wasn't lost, and she sure as hell wasn't ignorant of what was happening. She was making a choice. To stay quiet. The medic in him wanted to push, to demand answers. But the operator in him respected the choice. Silence was a weapon, too. One of the SEALs finally broke the tension. "If she's trained, why is she out here alone? And why won't she tell us who she is?" Ryan exhaled slowly, tightening the bandage around her torso once more. "That's the question, isn't it?" The woman's lips parted slightly, and for a split second, Ryan thought she might finally speak. But instead, she drew in another deep breath, closed her eyes, and steadied herself again. Her silence became a shield, an unbreakable wall none of them could crack. And yet, the longer Ryan looked at her, the more convinced he became that her silence wasn't born of fear. It was born of discipline. He'd seen something similar before Pose, who refused to break under interrogation. Operators caught behind enemy lines who gave nothing away. But she wasn't a SEAL, wasn't military as far as he knew. So where had she learned it? The night deepened, the wind carrying a chill through the canyon. The SEALs huddled closer, whispering quietly about the mission ahead. But Ryan remained beside her, his mind caught between duty and curiosity. Every detail about her screened contradiction, injured yet composed, silent yet powerful, vulnerable yet untouchable. She didn't need words to hold their attention. Her calm presence did it for her. Ryan glanced at her one last time before signaling the team to prepare to move. She was more than just a casualty. They all knew it now. And whatever her story was, it wasn't going to be simple. As they prepared to carry her across the rough ground, Ryan thought about the civilians he had saved before. They had cried, screamed, clung to him like he was their lifeline. But this woman? She carried herself like she was the lifeline. And that realization unsettled him more than anything. Because if she wasn't just a civilian, then who was she really? The team had carried her half a mile through uneven terrain before setting her down in a sheltered spot beneath an outcrop of rock. The canyon's shadows swallowed them, muffling sound, the air cooler now with night closing in. The SEALs moved with practiced efficiency, Torres and Mason securing the perimeter, while Diaz scanned the ridgeline. Ryan knelt again beside the woman, his pack open, hands already moving. But as he pulled away the improvised bandage she had tied around her ribs, Ryan froze. The fabric wasn't just tied, it was folded and knotted with surgical precision. The strip had been torn from the hem of her shirt, but the edges were clean, folded under to prevent fraying. She hadn't just tied it in desperation. She had known exactly what she was doing. Ryan leaned closer, tracing the line of the knot with his gloved finger. It was a square knot, reinforced with a surgeon's twist, exactly the kind he'd been taught in combat medicine school. Most civilians tied knots like they were wrapping a shoelace. This was different. This was trained. His mind clicked back to the tourniquet he had noticed earlier, high on her thigh. Tight, properly placed, angled perfectly above the femoral artery. He hadn't thought much of it in the adrenaline of first contact, but now, in the quiet, every detail screamed at him. "Chief?" Torres's voice drifted over his shoulder. "Something wrong?" Ryan shook his head slowly. "Not wrong, just unexpected." He pressed gently against her ribs, gauging her response. She didn't cry out, didn't even wince. Instead, she adjusted her breathing again, holding the inhale for a beat, then exhaling through her nose, long and controlled. Ryan muttered, half to himself, "That's deliberate." She looked at him, unblinking. He leaned in closer. "Who taught you this?" he asked quietly. Still, she said nothing. Ryan sat back, running a hand down his jaw. He remembered his own training vividly, how instructors had drilled them to improvise under pressure, to use whatever they had to stabilize a wound. It had taken weeks of repetition to make those techniques second nature. And here she was, pulling them off perfectly, alone and injured. It didn't add up. "You ever see anything like this?" Ryan asked, glancing up at Mason. Mason shook his head. "Not outside the teams. Civilians don't tie knots like that. Hell, most Marines don't tie knots like that." Ryan's chest tightened. Exactly. He opened his pack, pulling out gauze and clotting agents, but his eyes kept flicking back to the fabric knot. It was unnerving. She hadn't panicked, hadn't rushed, she'd planned. "Hold the light steady," Ryan ordered Torres. As he cleaned the wound, he realized something else. She had slowed the bleeding before they arrived. The clotting was further along than it should have been. She must have applied pressure, maybe even used controlled breathing, to keep her heart rate down and reduce blood flow. That wasn't survival instinct. That was training. He looked at her again, this time not as a medic, but as a man trying to solve a puzzle. Her eyes, sharp even in pain, followed every movement he made. When he swabbed too close to the wound, her hand twitched, not in fear, but in reflex, as though she knew what he was about to do next. "You've done this before," Ryan said softly. The other SEALs looked up. Torres frowned. "Done what?" Ryan hesitated. His instinct told him to keep it to himself, but the team deserved to know. Field care, trauma management. She's not guessing. She knows exactly what I'm doing. And she's already done half of it herself. The silence that followed was heavy. Diaz finally broke it. "So what are you saying, Chief? She's one of us?" Ryan didn't answer immediately. His eyes stayed on her. He wanted to believe she was just some civilian who'd gotten lucky. But luck didn't tie surgeons' knots. Luck didn't know to breathe like a sniper under stress. Luck didn't make silence look like a weapon. Finally, he shook his head. She's not one of us. But she's been trained. The woman blinked once, slow and deliberate, as though acknowledging the truth without saying a word. Ryan's stomach tightened. Who was she? He packed gauze into the wound, wrapping it tight with clean bandages, but his mind refused to stay on the task. It circled around questions he couldn't answer. Trained by who? For what? Why was she alone in this canyon, bleeding but calm, waiting like she'd known they were coming? As he worked, he noticed small scars across her forearm. Not random, not from clumsiness, thin, straight lines, almost surgical. Old training injuries, maybe? He'd seen similar marks on recruits who dragged themselves through barbed wire, or practiced combat roles until their skin split. Ryan exhaled slowly. The picture was forming, but it didn't make sense yet. Chief, Mason said quietly, crouching beside him. You think she's CIA? Ryan considered it. Maybe. But even then, CI operatives rarely trained to this level of field medicine. This was deeper, specialized. The woman shifted slightly, drawing Ryan's attention back. Her breathing faltered for a moment, and her eyes fluttered closed. Instinctively, Ryan reached for her wrist, checking her pulse. Still strong. Still steady. She was holding on, not just because of him, but because she'd bought herself precious minutes before they found her. He leaned closer, lowering his voice again. Who are you? Her lips parted, and for the first time he thought she might speak. But instead, she exhaled softly, her eyes opening just enough to meet his. The look chilled him. It wasn't defiance. It wasn't fear. It was acknowledgement. As though she knew he had discovered the truth, and that was enough. Ryan sat back, a bandage secure, his hands steady, but his mind anything but. He had treated countless patients, seen men bleed out in his arms, stitched wounds under fire, revived soldiers who should have been dead. But never had he treated someone who unnerved him like this. Because she wasn't supposed to exist. And yet, here she was bleeding, silent, and undeniably trained. The SEALs shifted uneasily, their eyes darting between Ryan and the woman. They didn't need words to know what he was thinking. This wasn't just a rescue. This was a discovery. And whatever secret she carried, it was about to pull them all into something far bigger than they had planned for. The canyon air grew colder as night thickened. The SEALs gathered close, forming a defensive circle around their injured mystery. Ryan crouched by her side, eyes scanning her bandaged torso, but his mind was elsewhere. Everything about her screamed discipline, control, experience. But none of it matched her appearance, bloodied, alone, and utterly silent. She looked fragile, but fragility didn't bleed quietly. Fragility didn't breathe in perfect rhythm, didn't tie surgical knots in fabric, didn't prepare for pain. Fragility broke. This woman hadn't broken. Her eyes drifted closed, and Ryan thought she might finally slip into unconsciousness. But instead, her breathing steadied further. She was there inside herself, retreating into a place where pain couldn't touch her. And in that silence, memories stirred. Years earlier. Mud caked her arms as she crawled through the pit, elbows digging into wet earth, her breath burning in her chest. An instructor's voice thundered overhead. Faster. You want to live? Move. She pushed harder, ignoring the sharp sting as rocks shredded her skin. The others groaned, some faltered, but she gritted her teeth, driving herself forward. Her body screamed, but she kept crawling, her mind clinging to a single thought. Pain is temporary, survival is not. Hours blurred into days. They deprived her of sleep, forced her into freezing water, weighed her down with packs until her shoulders bled. At night, she lay shivering in soaked fatigues, muscles locked in cramps, but she never cried out. The instructors weren't training her for comfort. They were forging silence, teaching her to find power where others found only weakness. Control your breathing. One of them had barked during a night exercise while she knelt in icy mud. Pain is air. Manage it, and you master yourself. And so she learned. Deep inhale, hold, release, again, until her body obeyed, even when it begged her to quit. Back in the canyon, Ryan watched her chest rise and fall. Even now, she was using the same technique, slowing her body, rationing her strength. He'd seen operators do it, but never anyone outside the community. Her eyes flicked open briefly, meeting his. In that moment, Ryan felt that she wasn't just surviving this night. She was reliving another. Years earlier, they pushed her through medical drills until she could no longer feel her hands. A torn shirt is a bandage. A belt is a tourniquet. No excuses, the instructor repeated, voice like gravel. She tied knots until her fingers blistered. She packed wounds on mannequins until her hands shook from fatigue. She learned to improvise under pressure, how to stop bleeding with whatever she could grab, how to keep herself alive when no medic was coming. Don't wait for rescue, they drilled into her. Rescue yourself. She never forgot. When they blindfolded her and dropped her into the wilderness for survival tests, she survived not because she was the strongest, but because she remembered. Tourniquet first. Breathing second. Silence always. She learned that silence confused the enemy, disarmed the interrogator, unnerved the rescuer. Silence was strength. Back in the canyon, Ryan touched the bandage at her side, adjusting it slightly. He felt her body tense beneath his hand, not in fear, but in anticipation. She knew what he was doing before he did it. He could almost hear the ghost of her instructors barking in her ears. You've been here before, Ryan whispered. Her eyes opened again, just long enough to confirm it. The other SEALs had stopped pretending they weren't watching. They'd seen hardened operators fall apart from wounds less severe than hers. But she hadn't cracked. Every move she made, every breath she took, screamed experience. She's trained, Ryan said finally, his voice low but firm. Maybe not like us, but close. Someone put her through hell and back, Mason muttered. Then why is she alone out here? No one had an answer. Years earlier, training didn't stop with survival drills. They tested her in ways meant to break the spirit. Interrogation simulations left her tied in dark rooms for hours, sometimes days. They blasted sound, flooded the senses, starved her of food. All to see if she'd crack, if she'd beg, if she'd speak. She didn't. When they finally released her, one instructor leaned close, whispering through clenched teeth. You lasted longer than most men. Remember this. Silence is power. Never give the enemy your voice. And so silence became her weapon. Back in the canyon, her silence now wasn't mystery. It was strategy. She gave them nothing. No fear, no weakness, no words to analyze. Just calm, unreadable presence. Ryan realized she wasn't refusing to talk. She was choosing not to. He looked away, unsettled. He had interrogated prisoners, patched up allies, seen every shade of human response under pain. But he had never felt this before. The sense that the injured person in front of him wasn't his responsibility alone. She was his equal, maybe even his mirror. She's not breaking, Torres said quietly, almost in awe. No, Ryan admitted. And she won't. The woman shifted slightly, her head leaning back against the rock. For the first time, Ryan noticed the faintest curl at the corner of her mouth. Not a smile, exactly more like acknowledgement. She knew what they were seeing. She knew what they were thinking. And she knew she had earned their respect without saying a single word. The canyon was silent, except for the whisper of wind across stone. But in that silence, the seals felt something unusual. Not pity for the injured, not superiority as rescuers. Respect. And as Ryan adjusted the final bandage, he realized something else. This woman wasn't here by accident. People like her didn't just stumble into danger. They were forged for it. The mystery wasn't how she had survived. The mystery was why. The canyon walls rose like jagged teeth around them, the night pressing colder with each passing hour. A pale moon slid free from the clouds, spilling silver across the rocks, throwing their shadows long and sharp. The seals had settled into a defensive posture too on watch, too catching brief rest, while Ryan remained with her, eyes sharp, mind unsettled. The woman hadn't spoken once. She hadn't asked for water, hadn't whimpered, hadn't begged for reassurance. She sat there, wounded but strangely composed, her breathing slow and controlled. It gnawed at the team. Men like them were conditioned to read people, to spot cracks in armor, to sense weakness before it surfaced. But no matter how long they watched her, the cracks never came. Mason finally muttered the question that had been on all their minds. "Chief, you sure she's not faking half of this?" "She doesn't act like she's dying." Ryan shook his head. "She's bleeding out slower because of the pressure and breathing. But no, she's hurt. You can't fake pallor like that. You can't fake blood loss. Then why does she look steady?" No one had an answer. And so, quietly, they began to test her. The first test, Ryan leaned close, his hands working deliberately against her bandages. He pressed a little harder than necessary, gauging her reaction. Any normal person would have flinched, cursed, maybe even passed out. She didn't. Her eyes flicked open at the pressure, but instead of recoiling, she shifted her breathing. Deep inhale, slow exhale, letting her body ride the pain rather than fight it. Ryan caught the movement. Subtle, precise, learned. He looked at the others, nodding slightly. She's not faking. She's controlling it. Torres frowned. Controlling pain? That's not normal. Ryan's silence was answer enough. The second test, Diaz, the skeptic of the group, decided to push. He crouched beside her, his voice deliberately sharp. "You know where you are? You know what happened to you?" Her gaze lifted to meet his, calm, steady. She didn't speak. He leaned closer. "If you don't answer, we can't help you. You understand that?" Still nothing. Just the faintest tilt of her head, her eyes locking with his, as if she could see straight through the bluff. Diaz exhaled, shaking his head. "She's stonewalling us." Ryan almost smiled. "Or she's making sure we show our hand before she shows hers." Diaz scowled, but he didn't argue. The third test later, when the team prepared to move camp further down the canyon, Ryan gave Torres a signal. "Lift her," he ordered. Torres moved to scoop her gently, expecting at least a sharp cry when her injured side shifted. But as he lifted her weight into his arms, she remained silent, her face tightening for only a second before smoothing back into calm. She nodded once, quick and subtle, as if giving approval. Torres froze mid-step, looking down at her. She nodded at me, like she's critiquing my carry. The others chuckled under their breath, but Ryan didn't. He saw it too. That wasn't the nod of a helpless victim. That was the nod of someone used to evaluating movement, efficiency, technique. When Torres set her back down, her breathing didn't quicken, her eyes didn't flutter with shock. She absorbed the stress like she had been preparing for it. Ryan murmured, "She's not just surviving this. She's participating." Watching her in silence, the SEALs stopped pretending they weren't studying her. Every movement she made became a clue. The way she placed her hand when adjusting her position, never randomly, always to relieve pressure at the right spot. The way she used her eyes, not her voice, to track their shifts in formation. At one point, Mason deliberately dropped a piece of gear near her, close enough to startle anyone in her state. She didn't flinch. Instead, she glanced down at it, then back up, her face calm. "She's aware of everything," Mason whispered afterward. "Like she's still running the op with us." Ryan's quiet admiration, Ryan sat back on his heels, watching her as she leaned against the rock. He felt the respect building in his chest, though he tried to bury it. He'd patched up brothers in arms who had screamed till their throats were raw. He'd seen civilians faint at the sight of their own blood. But this woman? Injured, exhausted, alone? She was holding herself together with nothing but discipline. Not once had she asked them for anything. No food, no water, not even comfort. She gave them silence, and in that silence, she commanded respect. Ryan realized something strange. He was treating her less like a patient and more like a fellow operator. The unspoken challenge, it didn't take long for the rest of the team to sense it too. Every man there had been through his own crucible hell week, survival drills, the endless grind of becoming SEALs. And what they saw in her felt familiar, so they leaned into it. Not cruelly, but deliberately, pushing the boundaries. They shifted her, tested her tolerance, asked questions she didn't answer, waited for her to break. But she never did. Her silence became defiance. Her calm became armor. And the more they tested her, the more convinced they became that she was no ordinary civilian. Ryan's realization by the time they settled her in a new position, Ryan's thoughts wouldn't quiet. He wiped his hands on a cloth, staring at her in the dim moonlight. She was pale, her lips dry, her body strained. Yet her eyes still carried fire. He thought about the tourniquet, the surgeon's knots, the breathing techniques, the scars on her arm. He thought about how she anticipated his medical steps, how she nodded at Torres's carry, how she refused to give Diaz even a word. It was all adding up to one undeniable truth. "She's been trained for this," Ryan said aloud. The words settled over the group like a weight. No one argued. Torres finally muttered, "Then the question is, trained by who?" Ryan didn't answer. He couldn't, but inside, a chill spread through him. Because if she had been trained to endure this kind of pain, this kind of silence, this kind of discipline, then she wasn't just a mystery. She was a secret. And secrets always came with danger. The canyon was quiet again, save for the whisper of wind and the steady rhythm of her breathing. The SEALs shifted uneasily in the dark, but one by one, their eyes returned to her. She had passed every unspoken test. Injured but unbroken, silent but commanding. She had proven herself in ways no words ever could. Ryan finally exhaled, the truth pressing heavy in his chest. They weren't just carrying an injured woman anymore. They were carrying someone forged in fire. Someone whose silence might be more dangerous than any scream. The canyon was still, the kind of stillness that felt alive, as if the rocks themselves were listening. The SEALs had rotated watch, the rifles resting across their knees, eyes sweeping the shadows. Coyotes howled in the distance, their cries sharp against the silence, but none of it seemed to touch her. She sat against the stone, pale and blood-stained, but there was nothing fragile about her presence. Even injured, even quiet, she carried herself like someone who belonged there. The more they looked at her, the less she seemed like a victim, and the more she felt like one of them. Ryan knew it first. He didn't say it aloud, but he felt it deep in his gut. The bond was forming, not because of words, but because of everything she withheld. Silent recognition. Ryan crouched by her again, checking her bandage. She watched him work, not with fear or gratitude, but with recognition. When he shifted the gauze, her gaze flicked to the tool in his hand, then back to his face. She anticipated every move, every step of the process, as if she had been here before. He paused, meeting her eyes. "You've done this before," he murmured, his voice so low only she could hear. Her silence was answer enough. For the first time, he didn't see silence as refusal. He saw it as language. Respect in the ranks. When Torres brought her water, she didn't drink immediately. She accepted the canteen, studied it briefly, then took measured sips. Controlled, disciplined. The SEALs noticed. "She rations," Mason muttered, half to himself. "Like she's on survival protocol." Later, Diaz offered her an MRE. She tore it open neatly, discarding nothing, portioning bites like someone who knew exactly how long it needed to last. "She's trained," Diaz admitted grudgingly. "Doesn't even waste a crumb." The men exchanged looks. They weren't talking about her like a civilian anymore. They were talking about her like a soldier. Wordless communication. As the night deepened, the air turned sharp with cold. Ryan draped his jacket over her, expecting at least a faint smile or whisper of thanks. Instead, she met his eyes and gave the smallest nod, short, precise, deliberate. He understood instantly. Acknowledgement, not gratitude. Not dependence. Just acknowledgement between equals. From then on, words weren't necessary. When Torres shifted positions during watch, her gaze tracked him, then returned to the shadows. When Mason adjusted his rifle, she gave the slightest tilt of her head, as if silently agreeing with his placement. They hadn't exchanged a single spoken sentence, yet she had slid into their rhythm, as if she'd always been part of the team. Ryan sat back, arms folded across his knees, unable to quiet his thoughts. He'd spent his life inside the Brotherhood of SEALs, a world where trust was currency, and silence was often louder than words. He realized something dangerous. He was starting to trust her. Not the way you trust a civilian who survives by accident. Not the way you trust someone fragile you're sworn to protect. This was different. He trusted her the way he trusted Torres, Mason, Diaz men who had been broken down and rebuilt by fire. He didn't know who had trained her or why, but the evidence was undeniable. She was forged the same way. And Ryan knew better than anyone. You couldn't fake that. The subtle shift, it wasn't just Ryan. The team shifted too, without speaking about it. They stopped testing her. They stopped treating her like cargo. When Torres carried her, he adjusted his grip carefully, not out of pity, but respect. When Mason handed her water, he did it the same way he'd hand it to another operator, not a wounded civilian. Even Diaz, the hardest skeptic of them all, softened. He sat nearby, muttering under his breath, but his eyes kept drifting toward her like he couldn't help but wonder who she really was. They had all started to fold her into the team's unspoken rhythm. She hadn't earned it with words. She had earned it by refusing to break. The moment of bond hours later, the wind shifted, carrying a sound through the canyon, a faint shuffle of rocks in the distance. Instantly, the SEALs tensed, rifles snapping into position. Ryan froze, waiting, listening. Then he realized she was listening too. Her head tilted, her eyes narrowing toward the same shadowed ridge they were watching. She didn't move her body, didn't make a sound, but her breathing changed. It slowed, deepened, matched theirs. Without a word, she sensed to them. The sound passed. Just a coyote scattering stones, not an enemy patrol. Slowly, the men lowered their weapons. Ryan glanced at her again, and this time, he didn't feel like he was protecting her. He felt like she was covering their flank, even while bleeding against the canyon wall. That was the moment the bond solidified. She wasn't an outsider anymore. She was one of them. The whisper of trust later, while the others dozed in rotation, Rain stayed awake, his eyes on her. The moonlight caught her face, pale but fierce, worn but unbroken. He wanted to ask who she was. He wanted to demand answers. But the truth held him back. Answers would come? They always did. But right now, trust mattered more. And somehow, without speaking a word, she had already earned it. Ryan leaned closer, speaking so softly it was almost a thought. Whoever you are, you don't have to prove it anymore. Not to me. Her eyes opened just enough to meet his. And for the first time, Ryan swore he saw it, the faintest flicker of relief. Not surrender. Not weakness. Just acknowledgement. The unspoken bond was complete. The canyon stayed silent, but the silence no longer felt empty. It was full now, full of respect, of trust, of the kind of connection forged not by words, but by survival. And Ryan knew one thing with absolute certainty. Whatever storm had brought her here, whatever secrets she carried, she wasn't facing them alone anymore. She had a team now, and they wouldn't let her fall. The canyon stretched endlessly in both directions, its stone ribs glowing faintly beneath the pale morning light. The seals packed their gear quickly, eyes darting across the horizon. Their mission wasn't over, but something had shifted. The injured woman wasn't just a responsibility anymore. She was a question mark hanging over their every step. Ryan stayed close as Torres lifted her again, careful not to jostle the bandage. She met the movement with the same stoic calm, her gaze fixed on the ridgeline ahead. Not a sound escaped her lips. But inside that silence, something was stirring. The first crack in silence as they moved deeper into the canyon, Diaz broke the quiet. This isn't normal, Chief. Civilians don't act like this. Civilians don't ration water like she did, or breathe through pain like that. She's one of us or something close. Ryan didn't answer. He knew Diaz was right. The woman's eyes flicked toward Diaz, just for a heartbeat. It was the first time she'd reacted to their conversation. Not a word, not even a gesture, just a glance. But it was enough to confirm she'd been listening all along. See that? Diaz muttered. She understood me. Ryan finally spoke. She understands more than you think. She's choosing what to give us. And as he said it, he realized how much weight that choice carried. A scar that spoke later. When Ryan adjusted her bandage, he noticed something new. Just above her ribs, beneath the blood and bruising, a scar ran jagged across her skin, old, healed, deliberate. Not the kind of scar from an accident. The kind born of combat or survival training. Ryan froze, fingertips hovering over the mark. He didn't need to ask where it came from. He'd seen scars like that before, carved by blades or shrapnel. You've been in the fire before, he whispered. Her eyes met his. For the first time, he thought he saw something flicker in them, something like memory, heavy and sharp. The flashback stirring the canyon blurred in her vision, and for a heartbeat, she was somewhere else entirely. Rain hammered down on a muddy training ground. She was younger then, but just as fierce, standing in a line of recruits as an instructor barked orders. Their eyes scanned her with suspicion, as if daring her to fail. Women don't last in this program. One of the men spat at her during a break. She had ignored him, dropped into the mud, and pushed herself harder. 1 push-up, 2, 50, 100, until her arms shook and her muscles screamed. She didn't stop until even the doubters stopped counting. And when the instructor circled back, his face unreadable, he simply muttered, "Not bad. Maybe you'll survive longer than the rest." That night, she had collapsed on her cot, chest burning, but her mind was alight with one truth: she would not be broken. Back in the canyon, Ryan saw the flicker of her eyes, the faraway look. He recognized it instantly. Flashbacks weren't unfamiliar operators, carried them like ghosts. "You're remembering," he said softly. Her gaze sharpened, snapping back to him. She didn't nod. She didn't speak. But her silence confirmed everything. Torres caught the exchange. "Chief, she's got history. I can see it. She's not just trained, she's lived it." Ryan didn't argue. He just adjusted her bandage, careful, respectful. Whispers among the teams, they marched. The SEALs kept their voices low, but curiosity gnawed at them. "Maybe CIA," Mason guessed. "They run people through black programs. Teaches silence, survival, resistance." "Could be," Diaz muttered. "But why would someone like that be dumped out here alone?" Ryan kept his thoughts to himself. He knew better than to speculate without facts. But inside, a storm brewed. Whoever she wasn't random. People like her didn't just appear in canyons by chance. A gesture of trust when they stopped to rest, Ryan handed her a fresh piece of gauze. This time, instead of letting him do the work, she took it from his hand. Slowly, carefully, she pressed it against her wound herself, adjusting pressure with practiced precision. The SEALs stared. "She knows what she's doing," Mason whispered. Ryan nodded. "Yeah, and she wants us to know she knows." It wasn't defiance. It was trust, her way of saying she could carry some of her own weight. Another memory. Her hands, steady on the gauze, sparked another memory. A training exercise gone wrong. Smoke filled a darkened room, the sound of gunfire echoing beyond the walls. A fellow trainee had collapsed beside her, blood soaking through his uniform. No medic was coming. No rescue, just her. She had pressed gauze to his wound, whispering silently to herself to keep calm, to breathe, to focus. She had saved him, not because she had to, but because she refused to let silence mean death. And when the instructors found them later, alive, she hadn't smiled. She had only nodded once, acknowledgement to herself that she could endure. Present connection back in the canyon. Ryan caught her eye again. He didn't smile, didn't press her for answers. He simply gave her the same nod she had once given Torres. For the first time, her lips parted. No words came, but the faintest exhale carried between them. It wasn't speech, but it was more than silence. It was connection. The team's realization. By nightfall, the SEALs no longer asked themselves if she was trained. That question had been answered. Now, the real question loomed larger, darker. Why was she trained? And what had driven her to end up here, half dead in the desert? They didn't know yet. But as Ryan studied her steady breathing, her eyes half closed against the firelight, he knew one thing with certainty. Her past wasn't a shadow. It was a storm. And it was coming for all of them. The canyon had grown colder, shadows stretching longer as the moon climbed high. The SEALs had moved cautiously, alert to every sound, the whisper of the wind, the distant cry of a coyote, the shifting of loose stone beneath their boots. Yet nothing was as sharp, as tense, as the presence of the woman between them. She walked with them now, supported when needed, her bandaged torso taut but strong. Silence still clung to her like armor, but the calm had evolved. It was no longer just endurance. It was control, authority, the quiet of someone who had survived storms far worse than this one. Ryan stayed close, keeping a careful hand near her shoulder. He had spent hours watching, studying, learning. Now he knew. She wasn't just trained, she was forged. The first flash, a sudden rustle, shattered the quiet. Rocks tumbled from above, and instinctively the SEALs took positions. Clear. Ryan barked. She froze, muscles taut, then pivoted with them, eyes scanning the ridge. Her movements were instantaneous, precise, revealing a memory in motion, a memory of exercises, ambush drills, survival under fire. It wasn't just reflex. It was instinct, honed to perfection. Ryan's heart thudded. This was no civilian caught in a canyon by accident. This was an operator, a survivor, someone who had been tested far beyond ordinary limits. Secrets unveiled later, As they huddled in the shadow of a rock overhang, Ryan finally dared to speak directly. "You've been trained." "For what?" Her eyes lifted to his, steady, unreadable. No words came, but the tension shifted like the calm before a storm. And then, slowly, she spoke, her voice low, deliberate, each word measured. "To survive. To endure. To protect what matters." The team exchanged glances. Her words were sparse, but each carried weight. She wasn't seeking help. She was reminding them this wasn't about being rescued. This was about completing what she had been trained to do. Shadows of her past, the story began to emerge in fragments. She had been part of a covert training program, one designed to create operators capable of surviving extreme conditions alone. They had pushed her to the edge: hunger, pain, isolation, and she had not broken once. Her eyes darkened as she recounted in pieces the missions she had trained for but never fully disclosed. Exercises in enemy territory. Survival simulations without aid. Medical improvisation with nothing but raw materials. And always the silence, because silence was strength, and strength meant life. Ryan's jaw tightened. He had treated men broken by half of this. And yet she had endured, thrived, carried herself through it all without complaint. "She's incredible," Torres whispered. "Not incredible," Ryan corrected, his eyes never leaving hers. "Prepared, calculated, dangerous in her own right. The first real threat." As the first light of dawn struck the canyon floor, a new sound reached their ears: footsteps, careful and deliberate, echoing off the rock walls. Ryan's team immediately went into defensive mode, weapons raised. The woman froze. Not with fear, with awareness. She lifted her head slowly, scanning the direction of the noise, and in that motion, she became a sentinel. Her eyes flicked between the seals and the ridge above, silently issuing instructions through posture and glance alone. Ryan felt a chill. He had trained with men like her, but never seen one in action so silent, so commanding, so unbreakable. When the first figures appeared, a small, armed reconnaissance team, she didn't flinch. Instead, she stepped slightly forward, the faintest tilt of her head signaling the SEALs to flank and hold position. It was coordination without a word, execution without hesitation. The calm in the storm, the standoff lasted moments that felt like hours. The intruders paused, scanning the canyon, clearly expecting easy prey. But what they saw instead was not weakness. It was control. It was calculation. It was survival perfected. Ryan watched her, injured, quiet, but utterly unbroken. She shifted slightly, her hand brushing a bandage, adjusting it like a warrior preparing for battle. And in that single motion, Ryan understood everything he had been watching for nights. The silence, the control, the endurance. It wasn't just survival. It was mastery. The intruders finally retreated, their presence dissipating like shadows at noon. The SEALs exhaled collectively, but Ryan's eyes stayed on her. "Not everyone makes it through this," he said softly. She simply met his gaze, unflinching. Then, with the smallest nod, she acknowledged an acknowledgement that she had already endured far worse, and that the storm they had just faced was minor in comparison. The bond solidified. As the canyon returned to silence, the SEALs looked at her differently. She was no longer just a patient. She was not merely a mystery. She was a peer. Ryan finally knelt beside her, meeting her eyes in a way he had never done with a civilian before. "You've earned this," he said. "Not help, not sympathy. Respect. You don't need us to survive. You need us to trust you." Her lips quirked in the faintest smile, vanishing as quickly as it appeared. No words, only the recognition of a bond forged in unspoken understanding, shared respect, and survival against odds that would have broken almost anyone else. Torres whispered to Mason. "She's one of us now." "No doubt," Ryan nodded, still watching her. He knew the truth. She had survived the past, endured the present, and now she was ready to face the future, not alone, but with them. The final realization, as the sun climbed higher, painting the canyon walls gold, Ryan realized something profound. This woman had not come here by accident. Her training, her silence, her endurance, it had all prepared her for this moment. Not just to survive, but to command respect, to instill trust, and to remind the SEALs that strength isn't always loud. Sometimes strength is quiet. Sometimes strength is a storm held within, revealed only to those who recognize it. And sometimes that storm walks silently into your life, changes everything, and leaves you speechless in awe. Ryan exhaled slowly, watching her rise to move with the team. She didn't stumble. She didn't falter. Every step was controlled, deliberate. She had faced worse. She had survived. And now, in that moment, she had found not only her place in the canyon, but among them, a bond forged in silence, in strength, and in respect. The storm had broken, and in its aftermath, a quiet power remained. She was not just alive. She was unstoppable.